What you are witnessing is the first in a planned series of videos reviewing the Bahnsen-Stein debate on Does God Exist? This video is divided into 3 parts. The first part provides an overview of the debate, a brief biography of both debaters, and a brief statement of bias as it relates to me as the debate judge. In the second part, I will analyze the organizational structure of the Christian's opening statement, as well as how much time he allocated to each section of his speech. Finally, in the third part, I will assess the content of Bahnsen's opening statement itself from both logical and rhetorical perspectives. My intent is to be not only fair, but charitable. Where appropriate, I will try to steelman his arguments. So, turning to the debate itself, the topic was, Does God Exist? Representing Christianity was Dr. Greg Bahnsen. Representing atheism was Dr. Gordon Stein. It took place at the University of California at Irvine in 1985. The debate was divided into 4 segments. In the first segment, each debater gave a 15-minute opening statement, followed by 5-minute cross-examinations, followed by 8-minute rebuttals. Then, in the second segment, they inverted the speaking order and had slightly shorter speeches. So the opening statements were 8 minutes, followed by 4-minute cross-examinations, followed by 5-minute rebuttals. In the third segment, the debaters gave their closing statements, which were 10 minutes. And then finally, the fourth segment was the opportunity for the audience to ask questions and the debaters to answer them, and that lasted 15 minutes. One of the things I loved about this debate was the cross-examination periods. Cross-examination is really helpful to ensure that the 2 debaters aren't talking past one another. If you watch the debate, I think it will become clear that one of the debaters was clearly talking past the other. The cross-examination period was really helpful in exposing that. But I also have some criticisms of the debate format itself. First, I thought it was way more complicated than it needed to be. As the moderator explained, it was divided into 4 segments. But why? I'd love to know what the organizers were thinking. I don't get it. Second, it is very unusual to have 2 opening statements per debater. In fact, off the top of my head, I cannot think of another debate that has had each person give 2 opening statements. Maybe the idea was this. The first segment would focus on the Christian position, while the second segment would focus on atheism. But if so, then the speeches in each segment should have had equal time limits. Otherwise, you're putting the atheist debater at a disadvantage. Third, in a format like this, where both debaters are expected to shoulder a burden of proof, it's fundamentally unfair for the same speaker both to speak first and last. Normally, the only time one side gets the first and last word is when that side, and that side only, has a burden of proof. For example, in criminal court cases, the prosecution gets the first opening statement and the last closing statement, but that is because the prosecution has the burden of proof to show that the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But again, that is not how the Bahnsen-Stein debate worked. Since both Bahnsen and Stein were evidently expected to defend their worldviews, if Bahnsen got to go first, Stein should have been allowed to go last. I fault the organizers, Bahnsen, and Stein for allowing this format. Stein in particular should never have agreed to this format for that reason. Allow me now to introduce the debaters. Greg L. Bahnsen, who lived from 1948 to 1995, was an ordained minister in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church and a full-time scholar in residence for the Southern California Center for Christian Studies. He received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Southern California, specializing in the theory of knowledge. He previously received the BA magna cum laude philosophy from Westmont College and then simultaneously earned the Master of Divinity and Master of Theology degrees from Westminster Theological Seminary. Dr. Bahnsen lectured to a broad range of evangelical Christian groups at many colleges and conferences. He was an experienced apologist and debater. He published numerous scholarly articles, a number of well-known books, and had over 1,500 recorded lectures and sermons. Gordon Stein was an American author, physiologist, and activist for atheism and religious skepticism. He earned degrees in psychology and zoology, a doctorate in physiology from Ohio State University, and master's degrees in management and library science from the University of Rochester, Adelphi College, and UCLA. He was an author of books for secular humanist and rationalist publications. He was also a critic of claims of paranormal phenomena. Stein was an outspoken atheist and publicly debated Christian apologists such as Greg Bahnsen. He served as the editor of the American Rationalist and was the librarian of the Center for Inquiry, which houses both the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, or CSICOP, and the Council for Secular Humanism. Finally, since the role of presuppositions looms so large in this particular debate, I thought it would be appropriate to declare my own biases. Regarding Dr. Bahnsen, I have many sources of bias against him. First, I'm an atheist, and so I reject his worldview. Second, I am personal friends with one of Bahnsen's other opponents, Eddie Tabash. Third, when I was running the Internet Infidels, I was involved behind the scenes with philosopher Michael Martin's published critiques of presuppositionalism, including his critiques of Bahnsen. Regarding Dr. Stein, I also have biases against him. First, I am not a fan of Stein as a defender of atheism. This is nothing personal. I had no personal conflicts with Dr. Stein when he was alive. In fact, I never knew him personally. But as a defender of atheism, I regard Dr. Stein as a village atheist who is simply ignorant of the philosophy of religion. Second, I'm not a fan of Stein as a debater. I do not know how or why, but somehow Dr. Stein established himself at the Council for Secular Humanism as the guy to represent atheism and humanism in debates. But I think Dr. Stein was inept as a debater. The average high school sophomore debate team member could do a better job debating than Dr. Stein did. In spite of all these biases against both opponents, I think I can be fair in my assessment of the debate. But in a spirit of transparency, I wanted to get them out in the open. Ultimately, you, the listener, will be the final judge as to whether or not my assessment is fair. Speaking of my assessment, I want to review how I assess debate performances. I look at three things. First, I look at what topics did the debater choose to talk about, and how much time did they allocate to each topic. Second, I look at how effective the debater was in making their arguments. I do this in two ways. First, A, from a logical perspective, I provide an objective assessment of whether the argument is sound, if deductive, or strong, if inductive. Second, B, from a rhetorical perspective, I offer my subjective assessment of whether the argument is likely to be persuasive to an audience. Third, I look at the debater's clash with the other debater's arguments. I look at items 1 and 2 in all speeches. I consider item 3 in all speeches except for opening statements. With that in mind, let's turn to Dr. Bahnsen's opening statement. Bahnsen's opening statement consisted of 2,312 words spoken in 15 minutes for an average speaking rate of 154 words per minute. A little on the fast side, but not so fast as to be a problem. His opening statement had two sections, an introduction and his case for God's existence. What is striking to me is the amount of time he spent on introductory remarks. He spent almost 30% of his speaking time. Now, I'm not saying that this is the worst time allocation in the history of theist-atheist debate opening statements, but I am saying this is the worst time allocation in the history of theist-atheist debate opening statements that I can remember. Wasting roughly 30% of your speaking time on topics which don't actually advance your position is insane. Let's zoom in to his organizational structure, what I'll call Zoom Level 2. In Section 1, his introductory remarks, Dr. Bahnsen covered three subtopics: definitions, scope, and then a concession to Dr. Stein and what I'll call some miscellaneous comments. I loved the fact that he immediately defined his terms and then covered what was, and just as importantly, what was not relevant to the debate. I thought his third subtopic was a strange choice, but I also think I understand why he did that. The reason won't become clear until later on in the debate, and if I ever do a review of the entire debate, I will talk about that in a later video. Anyway, I think this greater level of detail just reinforces what I said on the previous slide. Spending roughly 30% of your speaking time on introductory remarks is just crazy. In section 2, Bahnsen finally gets around to talking about his case for the existence of God. Or does he? After a careful review of the debate transcript, I've concluded that his first two subsections are actually more introductory remarks. Everything he says in subsection A about the nature of evidence could be agreed to by an atheist philosopher of religion. Off the top of my head, I can think of numerous atheist philosophers of religion who would probably agree with this entire section, such as Paul Draper, Evan Fales, Graham Oppie, Keith Parsons, John Schellenberg, and Eric Wielenberg, to name just a few. I'm trying to be charitable to Dr. Bahnsen and understand why he blew 16% of his speaking time talking about the nature of evidence. The only thing I can come up with is that he was trying to preempt arguments and objections he expected Dr. Bahnsen to raise in the debate. And in fairness, sometimes I think it makes sense to preempt your opponent's arguments or objections. But in this case, I think Dr. Bahnsen would have been far better off if he had saved this material for a rebuttal. The next subsection, B, was a little bit better insofar as Bahnsen listed off a bunch of things he says are evidence for God's existence, but Bahnsen's purpose in listing those things was not, ironically, to argue for God's existence in some sort of quote-unquote neutral way an atheist would accept. In fact, I am quite confident that Bahnsen would say that the idea of neutrality is a myth. Rather, Bahnsen's purpose was to illustrate the crucial role that presuppositions play in conflicts between worldviews. And again, just as we saw with subsection A, there wasn't anything in subsection B which an atheist philosopher of religion need disagree with. This much is clear. It doesn't take 985 words, or 42.6% of your entire speech, to make the point of subsection B. So to sum up so far, as I read the transcript of subsections A and B, I found myself asking, is Dr. Bahnsen here to debate God's existence, or is he here to teach a philosophy of religion or apologetics seminar? Again, I just thought Dr. Bahnsen's strategic choice of time allocation was poor. Finally, we turn to the third and final subsection, C. Section C amounts to a little bit more than 10% of the total word count in his speech, and yet it is the first and only time in this speech that Bahnsen actually offers an argument for God's existence. I think this is a really bad move on Bahnsen's part for two reasons. First, again, at least 90% of a debater's opening statement should be devoted to defending his or her position, with the remaining 10% or less used for the introduction and conclusion. But as my math shows, Bahnsen managed to do the precise opposite. He devoted roughly 90% of his opening statement to introductory remarks and only 10% to arguing for God's existence. The second reason I think this was a really bad move on Bahnsen's part is due to the nature of Bahnsen's transcendental argument. When Bahnsen and Stein debated in 1985, I think it's fair to say that the presuppositionalist approach to apologetics in general and the transcendental argument for God, or TAG specifically, were not well known outside of some very tiny Christian circles. It was almost certainly unknown to non-Christians, including atheists. Because TAG is so different from traditional theistic arguments, I think Bahnsen would have been far better off explaining the argument itself and defending it. So to wrap up this slide, I think Dr. Bahnsen's choice of topics and allocation of topics was just cringeworthy. If we switch our focus from time allocation to logical and rhetorical effectiveness, however, I think things look much different, and in a good way for Dr. Bahnsen. On this slide, I've shown my ratings for everything except for the last subsection, the one in which he defends TAG. I was fairly generous in my ratings, both when assessing the logic of his content as well as the rhetorical appeal. Let's now turn to that final and crucial subsection. Philosophers trace transcendental arguments back to the philosopher Immanuel Kant. In his critique of pure reason, Kant used the word transcendental to refer to our a priori knowledge of objects. As the late philosopher Anthony Bruckner explained, Kant's goal was to refute extreme Cartesian skepticism. Bruckner reconstructs the ontological version of Kant's argument as having two stages. I'm not going to read the rest of the quotation, but I've included it for interested viewers so they may pause the video if they wish to read it. The Christian philosopher James Anderson provides a helpful description of the link between Kant's transcendental arguments and what contemporary Christian apologists like Bahnsen call the transcendental argument for God's existence. Quote, "Brought to prominence by Kant, transcendental arguments purport to uncover what must be the case, or alternatively, what we must take to be the case, in order for various kinds of intentional operation, e.g., individuating, predicating, perceiving, knowing, to be possible. Transcendental arguments are commonly thought of as anti-skeptical arguments. The idea being to show that whatever it is that the skeptic doubts or denies turns out to be a necessary precondition of some other principle or experience that the skeptic takes for granted. In the case of a theistic transcendental argument, it is skepticism about the existence of God that comes under scrutiny," end quote. By the way, while I've got his picture up on the slide, I'm happy to report that in my limited interactions with Dr. Anderson, he's a really nice guy. Moving on, as Dr. Anderson alluded to in the passage I just read, a key concept in transcendental arguments is a special kind of necessary condition, which contemporary proponents sometimes call a precondition. X is a precondition for the possibility of Y, in the sense that Y cannot obtain without X. But what do we mean by the word cannot? The claim X is a precondition for the possibility of Y is metaphysical and a priori, not natural and a posteriori. Why this matters? As the philosopher Stern wrote in his book back in 1999, the basis for claiming X is a precondition for the possibility of Y is not just because certain natural laws governing the actual world and discoverable by the empirical sciences make this impossible in the way that, for example, life cannot exist without oxygen, but because certain metaphysical constraints that can be established by reflection make X a condition for Y in every possible world. For example, existence is a condition for thought, as the former is metaphysically required in order to do or be anything at all. Another Christian philosopher, Sean Choi, has written probably the best analysis in print of Dr. Stein's argument. I've provided the citation for Choi's article at the bottom of this slide and several of the next slides for those of you who want to research this further. Choi comments on the Stern quotation I gave on the last slide. According to Choi, the general form of transcendental arguments can be stated as follows. Transcendental argument premise 1, Q. Transcendental argument premise 2. It is necessary that, if not P, then not Q. So, transcendental argument 3, so P. I personally happen to agree with the way Choi puts transcendental arguments in standard form, but philosophers are divided on the best way to do that. In fact, while I'm mentioning disagreement, I should also mention that I'm aware of at least one philosopher who denies that Bahnsen's argument has anything at all to do with transcendental arguments in Kant's sense. All of this disagreement could have been avoided if Bahnsen had put his argument in standard form, but it is what it is. Just be aware that not everyone who has thought about this necessarily agrees with Anderson and Choi. Using the general pattern shown on the previous slide, Choi then offers the following rational reconstruction of Bahnsen's argument. Premise 1, there is a rational justification for the laws of logic. Premise 2, it is necessary that, if Christian theism is false, then there is no rational justification for the laws of logic. So, 3, Christian theism is true. As written, Bahnsen's argument, or Choi's reconstruction of Bahnsen's argument, is valid. If premises 1 and 2 are true, then 3 must be true. But what is the supporting argument for premise 2? Choi then suggests the following preliminary way of reconstructing Bahnsen's supporting argument for premise 2. It goes as follows. Premise 2a. If there is a non-Christian theistic way to justify the laws of logic, then it will be either the a priori way, or the a posteriori way, or the conventionalist way. Premise 2b. Neither the a priori way, nor the a posteriori way, nor the conventionalist way will justify the laws of logic. Premise 2c. So, there is no non-Christian theistic way to justify the laws of logic. And so, premise 2, it is necessary that, if Christian theism is false, then there is no rational justification for the laws of logic. Now, by a priori way, Bahnsen means, or at least I think he means, independent of experience. And by a posteriori way, Bahnsen means, or I think he means, on the basis of experience. And by the conventionalist way, I take him to mean something like an intersubjective agreement between the users of logic. People imagine that there are these abstract entities like the laws of logic which somehow exist outside of space and time, but this is just a useful fiction. The problem, as Sean Choi points out, is that even if Bahnsen had established the truth of premises 2a and 2b in the debate, this supporting argument, the one that I've got on the screen that Sean Choi reconstructed, is insufficient to establish the truth of premise 2. It seems to need an additional premise. And so Choi proposes adding premise 2d. Necessarily, if there is a rational justification for the laws of logic, then it will be either Christian theistic or non-Christian theistic. But Choi points out even this argument doesn't work. While premise 2c follows from 2a and 2b, the larger inference from 2a and 2b and 2c and 2d to premise 2 is simply invalid. The problem is that even with the plausibly necessarily true premise 2d, there is no way to derive the necessary proposition 2 as a conclusion as long as premises 2a and 2b are themselves contingent. So then Choi revises the argument again. He further revises the supporting argument by adding the boldface words you see on the slide. And once you do that, the supporting argument does seem to be valid. But is it sound? Choi doesn't think so, and that's my next objection to tag. Consider premise 2b star. It is necessary that neither the a priori way, nor the a posteriori way, nor the conventionalist way will justify the laws of logic. Why should we think that's true? Choi didn't use these exact words, but in effect he asks, did Bahnsen establish the truth of premise 2b star by refuting the a priori way, the a posteriori way, and the conventionalist way? Let's take a close look at what Bahnsen said during his opening statement in support.
And so I come thirdly then to the transcendental proof of God's existence. How then should the difference of opinion between the theist and the atheist be rationally resolved? That was my opening question. We've seen two of Dr. Stein's errors regarding it: the crackers in the pantry fallacy and the pretended neutrality fallacy. In the process of discussing them, we have observed that belief in the existence of God is not tested in any ordinary way like other factual claims. And the reason for that is metaphysically because of the non-natural character of God, and epistemologically because of the presuppositional character of commitment for or against His existence. Arguments over conflicting presuppositions between worldviews, therefore, must be resolved somewhat differently, and yet still rationally, than conflicts over factual existence claims within a worldview or system of thoughts. When we go to look at the different worldviews that atheists and theists have, I suggest that we can prove the existence of God from the impossibility of the contrary. The transcendental proof for God's existence is that without Him, it is impossible to prove anything. The atheist worldview is irrational and cannot consistently provide the preconditions of intelligible experience, science, logic, or morality. The atheist worldview cannot allow for laws of logic, the uniformity of nature, the ability for the mind to understand the world, and moral absolutes. And in that sense, the atheist worldview cannot account for our debate tonight.
As the clip we just examined makes clear, Bahnsen did not refute the three options listed in premise 2b star. In fact, Bahnsen didn't even try. If you're not sure or disagree with me about that, then I invite you to pause this video and rewind it back to the previous slide. Review the transcript of the clip and search for the words a priori, a posteriori, and conventionalist. They're not there. So, if Bahnsen has an argument against those ways, he didn't give it in his opening statement. In his chapter, Scott Choi tries to be charitable to Bahnsen. He says that, at best, Bahnsen is only entitled to conclude premise 2b double star, but premise 2b double star does not entail premise 2b star. Choi's chapter is about the entire body of Bahnsen's work in support of the transcendental argument, not just Bahnsen's opening statement in this one debate. So I'm assuming that Choi has found support for premise 2b double star somewhere else in Bahnsen's work, not in the opening statement. The opening statement does not contain an argument for premise 2b double star. Still, let's see what Choi has to say about this revised version of premise 2b. As Choi points out, Bahnsen needs premise 2b star, not premise 2b double star, to get his tag off the ground. So, unless Bahnsen has an argument as to why, in principle, every possible a priori, a posteriori, or conventionalist way of justifying the laws of logic must fail, he cannot get his tag off the ground. Since Bahnsen does not present such an in-principle argument for premise 2b star, he has failed to show that his tag is sound, and thereby has failed to show that his tag is a successful proof of the rational ineluctability of Christian theism. My third objection to tag is that Bahnsen also failed to support premise 2a star. Notice that premise 2a star is a trilemma. The non-Christian justification for the laws of logic is either a priori or a posteriori or conventionalist. On the slide, I've highlighted in yellow the word necessary in premise 2a star. I've done this because I want to call attention to the modal nature of the precondition. Premise 2a star doesn't merely claim that if there is a non-Christian theistic way to justify the laws of logic, then it will blah, 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 blah. The way that's worded, that could be a statement merely about the actual world. But the word necessary brings in all possible worlds. As we saw earlier, the supporting argument for premise 2 is invalid if it contains the original version of premise 2a. So in order to be a valid argument, the supporting argument has to use the version of the premise which Choi has labeled 2a star. The key difference is that between premises 2a and 2a star is that word necessary, which turns the premise into a much stronger claim. In effect, it says that premise 2a is not only true, but it is impossible for it to be false, again, because it's true in every possible world. Now, as Choi asks, why should we believe that premise 2a star is true? He contrasts premise 2a star with its negation. The negation of 2a star says that it is possible that premise 2a star is a false trilemma. I've highlighted in yellow the word possible to emphasize this. Rather than argue directly for the negation of 2A star, Choi instead adopts the more modest goal of showing that neither Bahnsen nor his supporters have adequately defended the negation of premise 2A star. As Choi explains, Bahnsen's tag is supposed to establish the rational necessity of Christian theism. And to defeat a necessity claim such as that, possible worldviews, as much as actual worldviews, are fair game. In order to illustrate his point, Choi asks us to consider the hypothetical worldview called Christianity. Christianity is identical to Christian theism in all respects, except that Christianity posits a quadrinity, one God in four persons. In whatever way that Christian theism is supposed to account for the laws of logic, Christian theism would account for them in like manner. Using the example of Christianity, Choi argues that there is no evidence, and certainly none presented by Bahnsen, that the proposition F displayed on the screen is false. But if Bahnsen hasn't given any evidence that proposition F is false, then it follows that Bahnsen has failed to defend premise 2A star. And if Bahnsen has failed to defend premise 2A star, then it follows that Bahnsen has not adequately defended his transcendental argument for God's existence. My fourth objection to tag is that Bahnsen repeatedly confuses the word atheism with the word materialism. To see this, let's first take a look at what Bahnsen says about the metaphysical nature of the laws of logic. The words shown on the slide aren't Bahnsen's, but I think they are a fair representation of what Bahnsen said and wrote. When Bahnsen referred to the laws of logic, he used them as an example of abstract objects. The existence of abstract objects is logically inconsistent with materialism. So Bahnsen's transcendental argument for God, or tag, at least when he referred to the laws of logic, in effect reduces to an argument from abstract objects. Now you may be wondering, why do I claim that Bahnsen's argument reduced to an argument from abstract objects? Again, let's take a look at what Bahnsen said later in the debate during one of his rebuttal speeches. In his first rebuttal, listen to what Bahnsen said.
I would say the laws of logic have a transcendental necessity about them. They are universal, they are invariant, and they are not material in nature. And if they are not that, then I'd like to know in an atheist universe how it's possible to have laws in the first place, and secondly, how it's possible to justify those laws. The laws of logic, you see, are abstract. As abstract entities, which is the appropriate philosophical term, not spiritual entities, as Dr. Stein is speaking of, as abstract entities, that is to say, non-individual or universal in character, they are not materialistic. And so you see, we have a real problem on our hands. Dr. Stein wants to use the laws of logic tonight. I maintain in so doing he's borrowing my worldview. For you see, within the theistic worldview, laws of logic make sense. Within the theistic worldview, there can be abstract, universal, invariant entities, such as the laws of logic. Within the theistic worldview, you cannot contradict yourself, because to so do, you engage in the nature of lying, and that's contrary to the character of God as we perceive it. And so the laws of logic are something that Dr. Stein's going to have to explain as an atheist, or else relinquish using them. The transcendental argument for the existence of God, then, which Dr. Stein has yet to touch, and which I don't believe he can surmount, is that without the existence of God, it's impossible to prove anything. And that's because in the atheistic world, you cannot justify and cannot account for laws in general. Laws of thought in particular, laws of nature, cannot account for the human mind and the fact that it's more than electrochemical complexes and events, and cannot give us moral absolutes.
So I think it is beyond reasonable doubt that Bahnsen believed the laws of logic were abstract objects. The next step in defending my objection is to show that atheism doesn't require a denial of abstract objects. To be clear, Bahnsen never wrote or said the words shown on this slide, but I believe the words shown on this slide are an accurate paraphrase of what Bahnsen believed. Bahnsen repeatedly referred to the atheist worldview, but what Bahnsen really meant is materialism, which denies the existence of immaterial things. Remember that Bahnsen defines the word atheism to mean the proposition God does not exist. So defined, the word atheism says nothing about the existence or non-existence of non-theistic immaterial entities. In contrast, the word materialism includes everything that atheism says, but adds on the extra claim, nothing immaterial exists. A materialist is an atheist, but an atheist doesn't have to be a materialist. An atheist who rejects materialism because they think abstract objects exist is a Platonist. An atheistic Platonist thinks God does not exist, but abstract objects like propositions, sets, numbers, possible worlds, states of affairs, and so forth do exist. For example, the philosopher Eric Steinhardt is an atheistic Platonist. Palgrave Macmillan just published his book, Atheistic Platonism, a Manifesto. Now, obviously, this book was published decades after the Bahnsen-Stein debate, but that's not the point. Steinhardt's book is an example of a possibility that Bahnsen just outright ignored. Another way to see the distinction is with the diagram I've now got on the slide. Let's divide conceivable reality into two parts, causal reality and acausal reality. Causal reality includes everything that exists that can stand in causal relations. That is to say, if something can be a cause, an effect, or both, then it exists in causal reality. In contrast, acausal reality, if it exists, includes everything that cannot stand in causal relations. For example, think of the number 2. Some philosophers believe that the number 2 exists not just as a mental concept in our minds, but as an independent abstract object. If the number 2 does exist as an abstract object, it cannot cause anything and cannot be the effect of anything. That's just what it means to be an abstract object. So examples of things which some philosophers believe to be abstract objects include numbers, sets, propositions, states of affairs, possible worlds, and so forth. People who believe that an acausal reality exists are called Platonists. For the sake of illustration, I'm going to assume that everything which exists or might exist in causal reality is either physical or mental. As anyone who has studied or read much philosophy knows, the relationship between the physical and the mental is a really interesting and controversial topic. What I'm going to propose is that we focus our attention on just two possible ways they might be related. First, one option, which I will call source physicalism, following the Purdue University philosopher Paul Draper, is to say that the physical exists, and if the mental exists at all, the physical caused the mental to exist. For example, imagine your garden variety atheist who denies the existence of all supernatural beings, but who rejects eliminative materialism. That atheist thinks the mental exists, but that atheist almost certainly believes the mental did not exist until complex nervous systems and/or brains evolved. That's an example of someone I would call a source physicalist, or naturalist, to be short. Second, another option, which I will call source idealism, is to say that the mental exists, and if the physical exists at all, the mental caused the physical to exist. For example, imagine your average theist who believes that a mind, God, created the physical world. On this view, there was no physical world until God created one. That's one type of a person I would call a source idealist, or supernaturalist for short. We can divide naturalism into two types. The first type, which I will call materialistic naturalism, or just materialism. Materialism says everything naturalism says, but adds on the claim that abstract objects do not exist. Thus, materialism reduces to the view that only material entities exist. You may have heard the famous saying from Carl Sagan, "The cosmos is all that is, or was, or ever will be." That is an expression of materialism. The second type of naturalism is what I will call Platonistic naturalism. Platonistic naturalism says everything naturalism says, but adds on the claim that abstract entities or objects exist. The important thing to take away from this slide is that both versions of naturalism are atheistic because they both deny the existence of God. Now let's take a look at the supernaturalism branch underneath causal reality. On the right-hand side is a view I will call theistic supernaturalism. It says that God exists. On the left-hand side is a view I will call atheistic supernaturalism. It says that God does not exist, but one or more other supernatural beings exist. I admit this is an unusual view. It is probably extremely rare, at least in the Western world, among people who self-identify as atheists. But it is an option. More important for our purposes is the fact that atheistic supernaturalism says nothing about whether an acausal reality exists. And so again, here is another type of atheist who could affirm the existence of abstract objects. The bottom line is that Bahnsen is flat out wrong when he applies that what he calls the atheist worldview denies the existence of abstract objects, or what I call acausal reality. And so, despite Bahnsen's claims to the contrary, his transcendental argument for God, or TAG, is not really an argument for the existence of God. Rather, it is an argument against materialism. And therefore, we should reformulate Bahnsen's argument as follows. Replace premise 2 with what I'm calling premise 2 prime by deleting the words Christian theism is false, and replacing that with the words abstract objects do not exist. And in the conclusion, or 3, we should replace that with 3 prime by deleting the words Christian theism is true and replacing those words with the words abstract objects exist. My fifth objection to TAG is that Christian theism underdetermines the Christian God's relationship with abstract objects. The diagram you see on the screen is taken from William Lane Craig's article, God and Abstract Objects. Craig has provided a useful service to the philosophical community by providing a map of the philosophical landscape with respect to one particular type of abstract objects, namely mathematical objects. I believe we can apply his diagram to abstract objects as a whole. I want to highlight 4 locations or destinations on this map. The first destination is absolute creationism. This is the view that abstract objects exist and that they were created by God. This is the view held by Christian philosophers Christopher Menzel, I apologize if I didn't say that name correctly, and Thomas Morris, among others. The second destination is Platonism. This is the view that uncreated abstract objects exist. This view is also held by some Christian philosophers, most notably the Notre Dame University philosopher Peter Van Inwagen. The third destination is divine conceptualism. This is the view that things like mathematical objects, sets, propositions, and the like exist, but they exist as ideas in the divine mind. This is yet another view held by some Christian philosophers, including Alvin Plantinga and Greg Welty. The fourth destination, or really set of destinations, is anti-realism, the view that abstract objects do not exist. As I read him, this seems to be the preferred position of William Lane Craig, with divine conceptualism serving as his fallback position. It is clear then that Christian philosophers are not in agreement about whether the Christian doctrine of aseity is logically consistent with Platonism. For his part, Craig vehemently denies that Christians can be Platonists. Let's take a listen or look at what Craig has to say.
The strongest challenge to the traditional doctrine of divine aseity comes from the philosophy of Platonism. Although contemporary Platonism differs vastly from classical Platonism in various respects, both views are united in holding that there exist uncreated entities other than God, for example, mathematical objects. Would-be Christian Platonists must maintain that John's domain of quantification is restricted in such a way that abstract objects escape his universally quantified statements.
And in fact, Craig argues that a consistent Christian must reject Platonism. He devoted 13 years of his life to studying the Christian God's relationship with abstract objects. Craig originally believed that abstract objects exist. In fact, I personally attended his 1995 debate at the University of Washington, in which he defended an argument from abstract objects for God's existence. Several years later, however, he became convinced that they do not exist, or at least he's highly skeptical that they exist. In fact, I've heard him say that he considers the existence of heavyweight abstract objects the single largest threat to theism. You heard me right. Craig has said that he considers heavyweight abstract objects to be an even larger threat to theism than the problem of evil. After his 13 years of research, Craig published 2 books summarizing his preferred approach for classical theists to avoid the threat of Platonism. Assume, for the sake of argument, that Craig is right, that the Christian worldview is logically inconsistent with Platonism. In that case, the only plausible way Bahnsen could consistently affirm the Christian worldview and abstract laws of logic would seem to be to affirm absolute creationism. Problem solved, right? Not really. While absolute creationism does not conflict with the theological doctrine of divine aseity, it suffers from another problem. Craig explains in his book, God Over All. He writes, quote, "The second, more serious difficulty with absolute creation is that absolute creationism seems to be viciously circular. In the literature, this is known as the bootstrapping objection, after the famous Baron von Munchausen, who tried to pull himself up by his own bootstraps. The problem can be most clearly seen with respect to the creation of properties. According to absolute creationism, God has created all properties. But in order to create properties, God would already have to possess certain properties. For example, in order to create the property being powerful, God would already have to be powerful. An impotent God obviously could not create anything. Thus, God would have to already possess a property in order to create it, which is viciously circular." End quote. Thus, Craig argues, Christians should reject the existence of mathematical objects, and, I presume, and for the same reasons, the existence of the laws of logic as abstract objects. But now Bahnsen has a real problem on his hands. What then could Bahnsen say about the metaphysical nature of the laws of logic? What then about the possibility that mathematical objects and the laws of logic exist as concrete objects? For reasons I will skip over here, Bahnsen, Craig, and I all reject formalism, the possibility that mathematical objects exist as physical objects. And I assume that we also agree, and for the same reason, that the laws of logic are not physical objects. So let's cross that option out. What then about the possibility that mathematical objects and the laws of logic exist as concrete mental objects? Again, I'm going to skip one of the options. I'm going to skip over psychologism, which would be the view that the laws of logic exist as concrete human mental objects. But if I had to pick, my educated guess is that if Bahnsen were alive today, he would say that he is a divine conceptualist, a person who believes that abstract objects, including the laws of logic, are really thoughts in God's mind. Craig raises 2 concerns about divine conceptualism. Number 1, it is unclear that divine conceptualism safeguards God's status as the sole ultimate reality. And number 2, God's thoughts seem ill-suited in various ways to play the roles traditionally played by abstract objects. He writes, quote, All this goes to place a question mark behind realism about abstract objects. Why be a realist in the first place? Perhaps absolute creationists and divine conceptualists have been much too uncritical in their acceptance of the indispensability argument for realism about mathematical objects and their ilk. Perhaps Christian theists need to take a good look at anti-realist alternatives to Platonism. If Craig's work and logic is correct, then the Christian theist has little reason to affirm things like the laws of logic, the laws of science, and the laws of morality as real abstract objects, or real objects in general, I should say. So, in sum, Bahnsen's transcendental proof for the Christian God hinges upon the claim that only the Christian worldview can account for abstract entities like the laws of logic, the laws of science, and the laws of morality. But Craig's scholarly work has called into question whether the Christian worldview is even logically consistent with the existence of real abstract entities. And that's my fifth objection to Bahnsen's argument. Next, I want to comment specifically on Dr. Bahnsen's claim that Christian theism is a precondition for the intelligibility of nature. But before I do this, I want to do something Bahnsen didn't do in his opening statement, and that's to actually set up the problem. To do that, we need to go back to the Scottish philosopher David Hume. In what follows, I'm going to be relying upon philosopher Leah Henderson's analysis of Hume. You can read her analysis at the link on the slide. Hume asked us to consider the following inductive inference. Premise: all observed instances of bread of a particular appearance have been nourishing. Conclusion: the next instance of bread of that appearance will be nourishing. But, Hume asked, what justifies this inference? Hume's bread inference is an example of an inductive inference called simple enumeration to an instance, or SEI. SEI inferences have the following form. Premise: all observed instances of F have been G. Conclusion: the next instance of F will be G. The fact that SEI works, when it does work, is what Hume meant by the uniformity of nature, or the uniformity principle, or UP. But what justifies UP? Philosopher Leah Henderson reconstructs Hume's argument as follows. Premise 1, there are only two kinds of arguments, demonstrative and probable. Premise 2, SEI presupposes the uniformity principle, or UP. Premise 3, a demonstrative argument establishes a conclusion whose negation is a contradiction. Premise 4, the negation of the UP is not a contradiction. Conclusion 1, there is no demonstrative argument for the UP. Premise 5, any probable argument for the UP presupposes the UP. Premise 6, an argument for a principle may not presuppose the same principle. Conclusion 2, there is no probable argument for the UP. Conclusion 3, there is no argument for the UP. Premise 7, if there is no argument for the UP, there is no chain of reasoning from the premises to the conclusion of any inference that presupposes the UP. Conclusion 4, there is no chain of reasoning from the premises to the conclusion of inference SEI. Premise 8, if there is no chain of reasoning from the premises to the conclusion of inference SEI, the inference is not justified. Therefore, conclusion 5, inference SEI is not justified. So Hume didn't think that induction could be justified. We are now in a position to understand Bahnsen's transcendental argument from the uniformity of nature, or induction, to Christian theism. Following the argument pattern described by Scott Choi earlier in this presentation, I've reconstructed Bahnsen's argument as follows. 1, there is a rational justification for the uniformity of nature. 2, it is necessary that, if Christian theism is false, then there is no rational justification for the uniformity of nature. 3, so Christian theism is true. In response to this argument, I'm going to suggest that we reject premise 1 and replace it with something else. In a recent essay, Paul Draper wrote, "Even if nature is not necessarily uniform, it still might be a necessary truth that, in the absence of evidence showing otherwise, uniformity is more probable than variety." I think Draper is right. Using Draper's idea, I suggest that we can offer an alternative transcendental argument, not for the uniformity of nature, but for the presumption of the uniformity of nature. Premise 1, there is a rational justification for the presumption of the uniformity of nature. Premise 2, it is necessary that, if uniformity is not more probable than variety, then there is no rational justification for the presumption of the uniformity of nature. So 3, uniformity is more probable than variety. Based on the argument I just offered, however, we should reject premise 1 of the reconstructed Bahnsen argument from the uniformity of nature. Nature might not necessarily be uniform, but we should presume that it is. And we should reject premise 2 of the reconstructed Bahnsen argument because the necessary truth, uniformity is more probable than variety, isn't dependent upon Christian theism. But that entails that Bahnsen's argument fails. In closing, I'd like to wrap up this assessment of Bahnsen's opening statement by quoting at length something from the presuppositionalist and Christian philosopher James Anderson. He writes, quote, "One criticism of presuppositional apologetics is that its advocates rarely, if ever, offer serious arguments for their distinctive claims, e.g., the claim that our ability to reason presupposes the existence of God. The criticism is overstated, but there is a measure of truth to it. I count myself a presuppositionalist, but I've been frustrated in the past by presuppositionalists who seem to imagine that declaring what Van Til's transcendental argument purports to demonstrate is tantamount to actually making that demonstration. Simply asserting that without God you can't prove anything at all, or that your very ability to reason presupposes the existence of God, does nothing whatsoever to explain why those weighty assertions should be believed. Likewise, for the failure of non-Christians to answer questions asking them to account for their ability to reason, to know truths about the world, to make meaningful moral judgments, etc., in terms of their own worldviews. Questions cannot substitute for arguments, no matter how pointed those questions may be." End quote. I couldn't have written it or said it better myself. Now, Anderson doesn't call out Bahnsen by name, and I don't know if Bahnsen is one of the unnamed presuppositionalists who Anderson had in mind when he wrote this. But, as my presentation has made clear, Anderson's comments match my analysis of Bahnsen's opening statement to a T. In the lead-up to the transcendental argument, Bahnsen beautifully laid out the nature of evidence and the presuppositional nature of conflict between worldviews. But once it was finally time to defend the transcendental argument, Bahnsen didn't deliver the goods. From a rhetorical perspective, I gave Bahnsen a positive assessment. I wasn't sure how positive I should be or how many up arrows I should give him, but I opted to give him a single up arrow. Here's why. For the average person who's never before heard the argument or had any exposure to presuppositional apologetics, my guess is that at the end of Bahnsen's opening statement, they would probably say to themselves, that's a really interesting argument. I wonder how Stein is going to respond to that. If and when I do formal reviews of the later speeches in the debate, the speeches after the opening statements, I expect that I will award Dr. Bahnsen more up arrows for greater rhetorical effectiveness. But from a logical perspective, my assessment is very negative. For all the reasons I've given, I think Bahnsen's opening presentation of his transcendental argument for God, or TAG, is a colossal failure. If you've enjoyed this review and you're not already a subscriber to my channel, go ahead and click the subscribe button. You'll get notified when I upload new videos. Also check me out on Twitter and on Blogger.